Armed forces by definition and by tradition tend to be very conservative and very change averse. And change, if at all, is brought about in the armed forces, particularly in large armed forces like India's. Then that takes place, change comes into being very slowly, serendipitously. It takes time. You try a little bit, you do a little trial, learn from the trial, then check out where you erred, and then you go on. So armed forces, by and large, are quite hidebound. They do not like sudden changes. But what's happened now is, for many years, a debate has been gone on in India for almost 50 years now about the future shape and size of India's armed forces. So Modi government today announced the Agnipath scheme, which will train a bunch of people every year on a short tour of duty to the armed forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, a 4-year tour of duty. So there is no confusion about whether it's 3 years or 5 years or 3 years or 5 years, which means 3 years and 5 years. That means two categories. There is only one category. All Agniveers will be recruited between the age of 17 and a half years to 21 years, and they will serve 4 years maximum, which means the maximum age at which an Agniveer would go back to society, having spent 4 years in the army or Army, Navy, Air Force, will be 25. It could be as young as 21 and a half if the person is recruited at 17 and a half. It's open to men as well as women. For women, the numbers will go up progressively. So it's not as if immediately equal numbers will be recruited. Numbers will go up progressively. That's what the announcement said. And this announcement was made by the Defense Minister of India, Sri Rajnath Singh, accompanied by the 3 chiefs and also Lieutenant General Anil Puri, who happens to be Additional Secretary in the Department of Military Affairs, which is usually headed by a CDS, but as we know right now we don't have a CDS, and that is also something which is under discussion. We'll make a reference to it as we go along. So what is the scheme first of all? Let's try and understand the scheme. Basic figures: 17 and a half to 21 years of age, 4 years of service. 4 years of service, people who come into this lot, people who come in through this stream, they will have a distinct insignia and a distinct status, a distinct cadre. And they will go to various units and various regiments of the armed forces. So, for example, somebody coming in can go into any of the infantry regiments of the army, or any of the squadrons of the Air Force, or any of the units, for example, missile units or transport units or fighter units. They will not be flying because nobody will be an officer. Or similarly, for the Navy, they could go into manning your computers, they could go into manning your missiles, they would do everything that a sailor at that age does right now. Because in any case, armed forces recruit people or what is called as other ranks or sepoy level, the entry level, non-officer entry level, very young. So they will do everything that those young soldiers are doing right now. Then what happens? How much do they get paid? So if you look at the Army's presentation, Lieutenant General Puri pointed out that they will get about 30 to 40,000 rupees, 30,000 to begin with, and 40,000 by the time they end up with their 4 years tour of duty. Now, this 30 will go to 40, but if I look at the figures carefully and figures that he presented on his screen, if you look at those figures, you can see that what might be called CTC, or cost to company or cost to country in this case, of this soldier, Agniveer, will be higher, even to begin with, will be higher than just 30,000 per month. So in the beginning, as the government's presentation showed in this press conference addressed by the Raksha Mantri with Defense Secretary, the 3 chiefs and Lieutenant General Puri, who, as I told you, is Additional Secretary, Military Affairs right now, that tells you that while initially the salary may be 30,000, but the cost to company or the cost to country, we'd rather say, is 4.76 lakhs. And similarly, when the soldier finishes his tour of duty, the soldier is getting paid 40,000 rupees as salary, But the cost to country then is 6.92 lakhs per year. So where is this additional money going, or where is it coming from? Because if you say 30,000 per month, that is 3,60,000. So where is the remaining 1,16,000 coming from? And similarly, when you say 40,000 per month, that is 4.8 lakhs per year. So where is the rest of it? That is 6.92 minus 4.8, that is 2,12,000. Where is that coming from and where is that going? That's an important point. So of the total entitlement of salary of a soldier, of an Agniveer, 30% will be deducted. 30% will be deducted and put into an interest-bearing corpus, right? So it's like his future funds, his future savings. So it's an interest-bearing corpus. And government will add a like amount. Another 30% equivalent government will add to this to top it up. That is how this cost to country to begin with will be 4.76 lakhs and will end up with 6.92 lakhs per year. Now, what happens to this corpus? This corpus will then be deposited. It will draw interest, and generally at the end of the day, after 4 years, the Agniveer will go home with 11 point approximately, the rest will depend on interest rates, 11.7 lakh rupees of a sign-off pay. So he takes that much money, or she takes that much money after 4 years. Now, remember, there is no pension and there are no ex-servicemen's benefits, right? So this is, you go home and you are now a civilian with it box checked on your CV and this much money. So you get, say, about 12 lakh rupees, 11.7 lakhs as per today's estimations. And then you have some other entitlements. For example, you can borrow a bunch of money. You can borrow about 18 lakh rupees for 3 years after you finish your tour of duty. What the terms of these loans, etc. will be, that we don't know yet for sure, because these things will come out in the course of time. Now, the armed forces chiefs, while explaining this, they were at pains to say that, look, our idea is to keep the armed forces youthful, diverse, and tech savvy. Those are the three things they said: youthful, diverse, and tech savvy. Of course, they didn't say that this will bring down the pension budget, although that is a very important motive, and I will tell you some details about that as we go along. Pension and salary budgets also. But basically, General Puri explained to us in this presentation, and I will share the entire presentation, the entire press conference with you. There is a link with the description of this Cut the Clutter, so please check that out. So he says that with this, the armed forces average age, which is today 32. Now 32, if you think for the armed forces, it seems a little high. That's because everybody has a long tenure of service, right? So people, in a way, keep on doing the same work. They get more experienced, but they are serving till much later. So the average age is 32, which means you can also say generally that the average soldier of the Indian Armed Forces is more likely to be married, is more likely to have children, is more likely to have encumbrances. Now, if you can bring down that average age, so what the armed forces have said in this presentation is, or what their proposition to the country is, that look, with this, by 2030, that is 8 years from now, we'll bring down our average age from 32 to about 24 to 26 years. We are a youthful country. Remember, by 2030, we'll have population, say, suppose 140 crore or so, of which more than half of which will be below 25 years of age. So why not have set of armed forces which reflect that youthfulness? And the expression they use in their presentation is Josh and Jazba. That is passion and enthusiasm, right? So why not cash in on that? Why let your armed forces become older? Because otherwise they'll become older and older. Now, again, the armed forces have explained that we have studied different countries, and different countries have different systems. So see the story that I'm sharing with you. I'll share a screenshot of the top part of the story on the screen. You will see the headline. This is Snehesh Alex Phillips' story. Snehesh is our defense editor. So please read this story. You will understand this better if you want to know the minutiae or more details of this. But the fact is that they said, we've studied the system of many other countries. So different countries have different ways of maintaining their armies in a modern, youthful, tech savvy or tech friendly way. So the presentation says that some countries have purely volunteer armies, but there also within volunteer armies, they can have different categories. They can have different categories. So people can have different tours of duty. For example, if you look at Russia, Russia has a mix. Russia has a hybrid system. Conscription, which is for 12 months service. As we can see, it's not working out very well. Russian armies so far have done very poorly, and while they might be making some progress in the Donbass region right now, it's a grinding, slow progress. It's not a military superpower crushing a tiny military. They are suffering heavy casualties, and so far, again, the early lessons that the Russian generals have also learned is that their conscripted troops or their poorly trained troops are performing very badly. Nevertheless, Russians have a conscription system, 12 months, so they have regular soldiers who serve full tenure, and many others who are conscripted, which means they have effectively forced it to join the army, who serve for 12 months. So Israel also has a subscription system. Apologies, not subscription, conscription. Armed forces have conscription, subscription, the print needs. But because I think the print most of the time, I think subscription. So do subscribe to the print. That's very important. But this is conscription. So Israelis have a double system, which means men have a 30-month conscription and women have a 22-month conscription. Then South Korea. South Korea has a 21 to 25-month conscription, varying from Army to Navy to Air Force. Army obviously is less, Navy, Air Force might be more because it needs more training, it's more technological, more scientific. Then US and China. US and China don't exactly have conscription. It's called various things, although in case of China, it's a bit more like conscription. They have a tour of duty which is 2 years to 8 years, depending on your specialization and your trade, etc. And what that does is, that is the proposition of the Ministry of Defense, that keeps the armed forces younger, fitter, diverse, and more trainable. Now what will happen? Of these people who are recruited, this year for example, 46,000 will be recruited. Within 9 months they say recruitment rallies will be held and 46,000 of these Agniveers will be recruited. So first of all, remember, when Agniveer recruitment starts, other general recruitment for the armed forces at other rank level, which is the Sepoy level, Sepoy, airman, sailor level, that will stop. Because so far we've been having recruitment rallies through the year, and usually in a year across the country, depending on the need of various regiments, various units, about 60,000 people were recruited. That's because about 60,000 were also retiring every year, because the size of the armed forces had risen in the recent past, but now it's been there at around 1.3, 1.4 million for the three forces. So it's not going up in size. At the same time, there's been concern that maybe our armed forces are too large and too unwieldy. That today, firepower, standoff weapons, right? The man-to-man or soldier-to-soldier engagement is now, or contact is now much less than before. We are entering the beyond visual range, long-range artillery, missile, rocketry, unmanned armed vehicle, that territory now. So maybe you need to have smaller, niftier armies. So once again, the plan is that in about 10 years, Indian Armed Forces will now have a combination of 1:1, which is youth and experience ratio of 1:1. So say about half of the armed forces. Remember, this is an important point. This means about half of the armed forces will consist of Agniveers. The other half will be the Dadas who've stayed on. Now, you might ask me, what happens to Agniveers who want to stay on? So, in every year's batch, 1 out of 4, that is 25% of Agniveers will have the opportunity to continue on. Everybody will have the opportunity to apply to continue on permanently for 15 more years. So remember, if they get 15 more years, that will be 4 plus 15. 15 more years, but only 25% will be absorbed. Now, for that, there will be no UPSC or no SSB. That will depend on the recommendations of your superiors and their assessment. And there are people who worry about it, who say that if this is left to the CO, the commanding officer, the commandant of a battalion, whose main job is to keep his battalion ready or his regiment ready for battle, it will be too much administrative work for him to assess all this, or over his JCOs also. But we'll talk about that in a bit. What I'll do is, towards the end of this episode of Cut the Clutter, I will give you a list of pros and a list of cons, positives and negatives, or opportunities and fears, right? I will list them for you. I might give you my view here and there, but not very much of that. Now, again, minimum qualification for these recruits will be class 10 pass or class 12 pass. Also, the armed forces said that those who pass class 12 and join as Agniveers, they, after they finish their tour of duty, will be given certificates of having passed class 12, right? So they go into the workforce, they have the class 12 certificate. A lot of people have welcomed it because the reform was needed in the armed forces. Because think about what had happened with the armed forces. Indian armed forces had become too manpower heavy. Look at the defense budget for this year, for example, 2022-23. Defense budget is 5,25,166 crores, or you might say 5.25 trillion rupees. Out of this, 1.19 trillion rupees, or 1,19,696 crores, is going purely for pensions. Just the pensions. Then you look at the salaries. Salary bill is about the same as pensions. In fact, until last year, pension bill was higher than salaries. This year, it might be a little less than salaries. Then there is other revenue expenditure. So what is revenue expenditure? Revenue expenditure is maintenance, right? It's food. It's all kinds of consumables that the armed forces use. So if you add your defense pensions to your revenue budget, which is $2.3 trillion, then 2.3 plus 1.2 approximately for pensions. That is about $3.5 trillion out of the total budget of $5.25 trillion, which means very little is left. There'll be other expenses, there'll be some replacements, and there'll be some attrition, right? But the other budget for modernization, for purchase of new equipment, for adding more teeth to the armed forces actually becomes less than either the salary budget or the pension budget. So that is something that the governments have been wrestling with, how to deal with this. So various committees have been set up at different points of time. In late 80s or early 90s, I would say, when VP Singh government came in, there was a committee set up under Arun Singh. Arun Singh used to be Minister of State, handling defense, etc. under Rajiv Gandhi, left in controversial circumstances because he refused to toe Rajiv Gandhi's line on Bofors. So he headed this committee, which had senior officers from Army, Navy, Air Force, and they gave a report about this thick. But over time, a few of those recommendations have been implemented, but not much else. Because first of all, armed forces, as I told you earlier, are averse to sudden change or large scale change, because they are used to a system and they are used to being the way they are. And second, Indian armed forces are almost always involved in operations. So the concern is, look, will I do it in the middle of one warlike situation and the other warlike situation? But the other flip side of that is that if the Indian armed forces are always going to be, given our neighborhood, we are blessed with great neighbors, isn't it? Given our neighborhood, if we continue to move from one warlike situation to another warlike situation, does it mean we'll never modernize our armed forces? So that is what is happening right now. Now, there are concerns on this, and I will list those concerns for you. I will also read out to you some quotes from some of the stronger critics of the scheme. And these are all respected senior veterans. So we have, for example, Lieutenant General Vinod Bhatia, who's a very respected veteran, who says, he says, and I quote, this death knell for armed forces, tour of duty not tested, no pilot project, straight implementation, will also lead to militarization of society. Nearly 40,000 rejected and dejected, jobless, semi-trained ex-Agniveers will go back to their villages. This is not a good idea. No one will gain. There is also an article by Lieutenant General P.R. Shankar, who is a former director of artillery. Now, artillery is very key to armed forces these days, modern warfare, as we are seeing in Ukraine right now, between Ukraine and Russia. So, Lieutenant General P.R. Shankar, he wrote, and it's a longish quote, so I will break it down. He says, tour of duty is an exercise being undertaken without adequate staff or capacity, in order to create which the teeth have to be knocked off, which means he thinks that there will be a sacrifice of the armed forces firepower or their ability to fight, for which, to achieve it, in order to create which the teeth have to be knocked off. Then the not so well trained tourist, he uses the word tourist, then the not so well trained tourist will be part of a subunit in which there is a rat race for retention with no bonding or junior leadership. What he means is that by the fourth year, everybody will be in a rat race, that only 1 out of 4 of us will get permanent absorption. So why not it be me? Why should it be the next guy? So instead of bonding, they will have this rivalry and they will have chamchagiri and usual malaise of sort of Indian system or any system, very pronounced in our system, that will come in. That's his fear. Then he says, quote, this soldier will be expected to man BrahMos, Pinakas and Vajra weapons. He's an artilleryman, he's a gunner, so he's talking about artillery systems. He says this soldier will be expected to man BrahMos, Pinakas and Vajra weapon systems, which he cannot handle, and defend his position from marauding Pakistani and Chinese troops. And then he goes on to say, in a sense, tour of duty expects a Superman from a kindergarten. We might be producing an Abhimanyu, but he won't come out of the Chakra view, right? So that's a very pessimistic view. Now, as I told you earlier, I will list out for you some positives and negatives, pros and cons, some promises and also some fears. So, first of all, pros or positives or promises. Number one, it will keep the army younger. Most certainly it will. Number two, it will make the army smaller. Now, that is not something that the government will say because it's not politically correct to say. But the fact is, over time, this will make the army smaller. Because if you've been recruiting 60,000 every year, and now you recruit about 46,000 this year and about 40,000, because there's a limit to how many can be trained. And chances are that as we go ahead, because this training will be 6 months, unlike 1 year or 11 months for regular recruits, that's been the system in the past. Maybe in a year, 2 batches will be taken, because India, in any case, any armed forces have limited training capacity and a limited number of trainers. So fewer people will be recruited. Even if 60,000 are recruited, only 1/4 of them will stay back in the armed forces 4 years hence. So today, if you go by Indian Armed Forces existing strength, or what is called as sanctioned strength, Indian Armed Forces today have a shortfall of about 130,000. So that will not be filled up like this. In fact, over time, what is today's shortfall will then become part of a reality. So these will become smaller armed forces, which, if you ask me, my view is not a bad idea, because today's warfare does not need so many people. In fact, you should make a balanced, sensible, prudent trade-off between manpower costs and firepower costs. So, 1, army will be younger. 2, army will become smaller. Number 3, there will be a combination of experience and youth. Now, you might say that, are you bringing too many of these bachus in the armed forces, too many chokras and chokris floating around the armed forces? But the fact is, if the armed forces are recruiting 60,000 every year, that recruitment also is from the same age group. So at least for their first 3 or 4 years of service, they are of the same age. So they are coming in. The only difference here is that they will go away after 4 years. right? So there will be a question, and I will come to that question, that will they see sufficient stake in the armed forces? But I don't think that this will create any juvenility or any juvenile domination in the armed forces. This will not juvenilize the armed forces. That is not correct. So yes, this will give us a combination of experience and youth, because young people will come and young people will go out. Fourth, big saving in pensions, because these people, when they go out, will not be entitled to pension. So the pension bill over time will come down. Number 5, this will lead to skilling of the youth. So every year, nearly 40,000 skilled youth will go into our society, into our workforce, and our growing economy will be able to not only find jobs for them, but our growing economy also needs more skilled manpower. Remember, there are doubts on everything. I will list those, but these are the positives that are being listed. Number 6, the minimum age of marriage in India is 21. So if most of these people will join between, say, 17 and a half, 18, 18 and a half, some might join at 21. So very few during their 4-year tour of duty, very few will have the time or the age to get married, which means these soldiers will be unencumbered by families. I am not saying family is a bad thing, family is a wonderful thing, but these young soldiers will not be encumbered by family worries. Also, going ahead, there is a material benefit which obviously budget makers like, which is that because they will not have ex-serviceman status, even after they raise a family, etc., they will not get medical benefits, etc. So they will not be already struggling armed forces systems. Next point, 7th point, they will be more tech aware, because every year younger people will come in, new people will come in, and younger generations, newer generations will be more aware of technology and science. So they'll be more trainable in modern warfare with modern systems. And finally, this would lead to creating classless units in Indian Army, because right now Indian Army is still set, or Indian armed forces are still set, particularly the army, on the old colonial pattern, which is class-based regiments or caste-based regiments, because these Agniveers will be distributed everywhere. Ultimately, they will create a kind of a homogenization of the armed forces. Some of this has happened with some units. For example, if you look at the guards, grenadiers, etc. But even there is an old tradition. One might be an Ahir battalion, one might be a Jat battalion, etc., etc. But in this case, a lot more mixing will take place. That is seen as a more modern approach to building an army. Now, negatives. There are strong negatives that are coming up from the critics of this. About as many. So I'm listing as many negatives as positive. Number 1, that these will be tourists. These will be tourists. They are coming for sightseeing. They will never commit to the profession of soldiering. That's 1. 2, obviously, because they are tourists, they will have poor discipline. And particularly because the training time is reduced, they'll be poorly trained, poorly disciplined, with poor commitment. Third point, that this will lead to 2 classes of soldiers. One, regular soldiers, and second is Agniveers who will be coming in and out. Obviously, my counter to that would be that those 2 classes still exist, because new people come in, so there are seniors and juniors in the same rank. So they may all be sepoys or jawans or other ranks right now, but the fact is that there everybody knows that I will serve this much tenure, long tenure, and then get a pension. In this case, youngsters know that 3 out of the 4 of us will go home after 4 years. Next, this will result in a militarization of society, which means when these people go out, they may not find jobs, they may be frustrated, angry. So they've already been trained to use weapons, they'll go into a rural milieu, and if the economy is not booming, they will become a security nightmare, right? And then there's also a lot of stuff floating on veterans groups saying, what will they become? Security officers means bouncers or security guards, etc., etc. So that doubt is there. Next, that bonding and team spirit will not be there, because these people are going out in 4 years. So in 4 years, what kind of bonding and team spirit you have? Particularly when by the 2nd or 3rd year, you will already be in a cutthroat competition for for that 1 in 4 chance of staying on in the armed forces. Then that this will cause a home guardization of the armed forces. So the senior people, etc., will look at these guys as poorly trained soldiers, as kind of part civilians who have walked into the armed forces. So they'll be treated as home guards. Just as it happens in the IS, etc., a distinction arises between direct recruits and promotees. Right? So similarly, something like this might develop about these people also in the armed forces. What kind of stakes will they have? If the guy knows that I'm leaving in 4 years, right? Then if that guy is sent into battle where the soldier may lose his or her job, right? Armed forces run on the respect for order. So how persuaded will be that soldier with limited stakes to put his life on the line or not question an order? Because armed forces are built around the idea of never questioning an order. Then the appraisal process of these Agniveer troops might lead to chamchagiri or might lead to favoritism, etc. And other such complicated problems. Next, it will increase the CEO's administrative work. It will also increase the JCO's administrative work, and this will take them away from keeping their units operations ready or battle ready. And finally, the objection from the most conservative, traditional people in the armed forces. We might say that you're creating classless, casteless armed forces now, or units now, but is that a good thing? Because small unit cohesion in the Indian armed forces comes from their class and caste composition. So have you thought about this, or are you now deciding this in a hurry? So the concern there is, and I will share that concern a bit, is that Modi government does tend to act like somebody who jumps from a plane without checking the parachute, right? Because they take a good idea, they see something as a good idea, then they don't have the patience to work it out for a long time. So there's an article I'll share with you by Lieutenant General Prakash Menon, who wrote for us, who said, look, it's a good idea, but do a trial first, do a test bed first. You can't just jump into it. But Modi government doesn't work like that. They want to do it all together. Now, we've seen already that they announced the CDS position, and now the last CDS passed away, unfortunately, more than 6 months back, but a new CDS has not been appointed because, learning from the experience of the first position, Modi government is again fine-tuning that position. Modi government likes to learn while on the run, which is what they've done in this case.